Good evening. I'm hoping to do justice to share with you a little bit from this book, A Church Called Tov. Tov means good in Hebrew. And it has two parts. The book has two parts. So I'm going to mainly talk a little bit about what's in the first part today, or at least in this video, and probably on another day share with you from part two. Anyway, I share this not as a book review, but because I really want people who have experienced life in what is called the Lord's recovery to really consider what kind of culture you are in and you are part of and you are perpetuating. Because there's either a culture of good or there's a culture of toxicity. And I'd like you to just examine your experience, your practices, your observations in light of some of the points that I'd like to share with you. And by the way, this book is written by Scott McKnight and Laura Barringer, and Laura is his daughter. They were both at the Restore 2024 conference, or 2025 conference, where I bought this book. The foreword by Tish Harrison Warren. Just want to share a few things from that. The church is part of the good news of Jesus. It's part of the gospel. Jesus doesn't just save individuals. He saves people to be part of a community that brings his enduring light, truth, peace, and goodness into all the world and every part of human society. He is building a church. He calls the church his own, his bride, his body, his people. And yet our experience of the church often breaks our heart, disappoints us, even damages people. We can often see how flawed, sinful, unhealthy an institution a church may be, marred with injustice, corruption, abuse, misogyny, oppression, bickering, division, celebrity worship, unaccountable leaders, false and shallow teachings, and a Christian industrial complex formed around greed and vanity. So that's not what the Lord promised to build his church. His church is part of the good news, the gospel. I just want to read just a verse from the introduction from Matthew 9. When Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. So if you feel harassed and helpless, Jesus has compassion. And I hope that the church could be an environment where the harassed, the helpless, those like that man on the side of the road that the Good Samaritan went to, the church could be the place where such ones could be brought and healed. Chapter 1 is called Every Church is a Culture. So in the Lord's recovery, culture is almost a bad word. It's like, oh, we don't have culture, we just have Christ. But culture is what teaches us how to behave, how to think, what is right and wrong, what is good and bad. Our moral institutions, our beliefs, our convictions in community, in relationship with others. That's culture. So culture socializes us into what is considered proper behavior. In some churches, the culture is that it's wrong to go to movies or that you should read a particular translation of the Bible. Okay, so there is culture in every church community. And cultures are not just the leaders, dictated by the leaders. Yes, the leaders, they guide an organization toward a particular culture. But if it were just the leaders, we could just talk about leaders. But and we could just address leaders. But culture involves the interaction between the leaders and the congregation and their leaders. And that interaction forms the culture. In that sense, everyone in a church is complicit to whether a culture is good, and by good, we mean the good that is of God, or if it's toxic, if it's bad. A church's culture that is rooted in compassion creates an environment of safety, security, and openness. So I'd just like you to ask and reflect, do you have a sense of deep safety, security, and openness in your church community? To resist a toxic culture requires courage, hope, and perseverance. A rooted culture is almost irresistible. If the reinforcing culture is toxic, it becomes systemically corrupted and corrupts people within it, like racism, sexism, political ideologies, success at all costs, businesses. A corrupted culture drags everyone down with it. On the other hand, if a reinforcing culture is redemptive and healing and good, tov, it becomes systemically good and will instinctively heal, redeem, and restore. So I would like to just comment from these. One of the things in the culture of the Lord's recovery is to not be in the realm of right and wrong, good and evil, because that is equivalent in the teachings to the tree of knowledge of good and evil that ends in death. But I would just like to submit the fact that there are so many verses about good where we are charged. I loved some verses in Amos that are in the second part of this book. Do what is good, or tov, and run from evil that you may live. Then the Lord God of heaven's armies will be your helper, just as you have claimed. Hate evil and love what is good. Love what is tov. Turn your courts into true halls of justice. Another thing about the Lord's recovery is that I have not experienced it having a culture that is redemptive, healing, and good, that heals, redeems, and restores after someone has been hurt. And that's ironic to me because it's called recovery, but it doesn't recover people that have been hurt or stumbled or who have been abused, in my experience, or at least not enough. So culture speaks to the underlying tenor of relationships within the church as well. It is seen as the values and priorities that govern day-to-day life. A church culture isn't formed by someone launching a program for compassion or justice or kindness or goodness. Volunteering doesn't make a culture. Culture is formed over time through relationships, mutual interaction. So to change a culture requires ongoing commitment, lots of time, relationships, lengthy conversations, adjustments, and the willingness to change. Culture is something we learn, we practice, and we pass on to others. One church leader shares that when he saw the lead minister treating staff members unkindly, and that people were mostly motivated out of fear. Firstly, when he saw the abuse of the staff, he was shocked, glad it wasn't directed against him, rationalized it that it must be what real discipleship is about. He trusted the leadership that this type of training was what it takes to become an effective minister. He thought the people somehow deserved the mistreatment, and he was afraid that if he objected, he would be next. Has this happened to you? Have you seen someone treated in a way that you're shocked, glad it wasn't directed against you, thinking, well, this is what real discipleship is about, thought they deserved the mistreatment, or you were afraid that you would be next? Sadly, when you see this and we don't change it, we can perpetuate it. We can start to imitate this behavior, belittling others. The culture of abuse has a way of expanding. We learn it, we practice it, and we pass it on. And I believe that's been done by Witnessly. Toxic, flesh-driven cultures breed a lust for power, success, celebrity, control through fear, an emphasis on authority, and demands for loyalty. Have you seen that in what's called the Lord's recovery? Power, success, celebrity, control through fear, an emphasis on authority, and demands for loyalty. These values may not be explicitly stated or even outwardly recognized, but they fester in the heart of a leader and they cannot help but bear bitter fruit, damaging the culture of the church and seeking to destroy anyone who gets in the way. Have you seen anyone that leaders in the local church have sought to destroy? I just wrote down some initials, J.I. Well, I'll just say the names: John Ingalls, Bill Mallon, Joseph Fung, John So, Steve Isett, Joe Castile, and many others. So let's look at warning signs of toxicity. Part 1 of this book is called Forming and Deforming a Church's Culture. And chapter 1 was Every Church is a Culture. And chapter 2 is Early Warning Signs of a Toxic Culture. So again, I'm just going to share some points, and I hope you'd prayerfully consider, listen, and reflect on your experiences in the Lord's recovery or whatever church community you are in. So when you consider that Jesus intended to establish a church that was on a mission to proclaim good news to the poor and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, it's tragically ironic that church leadership, formed as it is by the character of leaders, can do so much harm. In this chapter, we want to draw attention to 2 early warning signs of a toxic culture. And those warning signs are a big one: narcissism and power through fear. Okay, so narcissism is a big word these days. And anyway, I'll just read a little bit. For some reason, church leadership at times seems to attract unempathetic, selfish narcissists. And I don't think the reason is too hard to come by, because people that are narcissistic like to be in the lead and get attention and look good, and what better role than to be a church leader. So what is narcissism? Let me just read the definition they have here from the Mayo Clinic, related to narcissistic personality disorder. It is a mental condition in which people have an inflated sense of their own importance, a deep need for excessive attention and admiration, troubled relationships, and a lack of empathy for others. But behind this mask of extreme confidence lies a fragile self-esteem that's vulnerable to the slightest criticism. A selfish drive for importance compels narcissistic pastors to surround themselves with admirers. They will break relationship with people who don't give them the esteem and honor they desire. Narcissists often gravitate toward enablers who will pave their way to power, or at least not stand in the way. The operative term that describes those enablers is sycophants. People who fawn over someone in a position of power and influence in order to gain power and influence of their own. I'm just going to be honest that I believe that there are a lot of narcissists in leadership positions in a lot of church communities, including, quote, the Lord's recovery, and they are surrounded with enablers who are themselves probably narcissistic, and they are sycophants. By being close to the leader, they themselves also get more power and admiration and stuff. So the last thing a powerful man or woman needs is a flatterer whispering sweet affirmations all day long. And the first thing he or she needs is a friend who will speak frankly. Friends don't let friends become narcissists. Friends speak frankly. And interestingly, friends is a really negative thing also in the Lord's recovery. The thought of having friends is really put down. So often narcissists want their church to be the best, the biggest, the most influential, the only ones who blah, blah, blah. Praising a narcissist church is the same as praising the leader. It follows then that anyone who dares criticize a church or a leader will be attacked by the narcissist for threatening the status of the best church ever and the pastor's own self-importance. So narcissists are extremely sensitive to criticism. So people get afraid to give any negative feedback for fear of repercussions, and they often feel the repercussions are just not worth it. It's all about control. So narcissistic leaders tend to gravitate toward non-denominational churches or non-accountable church structures where they answer to no one. Independent churches are especially conducive to leaders who want to be unsupervised and unchecked. Authoritarian leaders are ecclesiastical loners. They do not function well or willingly in the context of systematic checks and balances. They are fiercely independent and refuse to be part of a structure of accountability. Does that sound familiar? Refuse to be part of a structure of accountability, fiercely independent of other groups and other leaders, except for the sycophants, those that they surround themselves that are admirers and enablers. A narcissistic leader surrounds him or herself with a faithful inner circle of clones that implicitly accept all that the leader sets forth. Clones or tape recorders. Along with narcissistic leadership generally comes celebrity status, controlling behavior, constricted information flow, a culture of fear, consensus decision-making, and a lack of effective accountability. So then the second point in this chapter is power through fear. Toxic church leaders wield their assumed authority and position as weapons of lethal wounding power. When a leader manifests the power hatchet, a culture is formed that adjusts to the blade of fear. Power and fear are close companions. Combine this with narcissism, and a toxic culture is sure to form. So they talk about the Harvest Bible Chapel that Julie Roys published a report about in the World magazine, where it was said that the leaders fostered an abusive and fear-based culture where those who question leadership are punished. 2 former elders were formally excommunicated by the church and demonized in a video explaining the decision to the congregation after they persisted in questioning decisions made by the board. So they were excommunicated and demonized. One board member went so far as to say that publicizing viewpoints rejected by the elder majority for any reason is satanic to the core. So demonized, spoke of satanic attacks. We should be those who aim not at power but at goodness. They are not close buddies. So Ronald Enroth, an expert on power-based church leaders, described it as an abusive, fear-based church culture emerging with power-mongering leaders. Let's just read what he says. Ruler is the right term to describe the kind of people in authoritarian leadership roles. They are spiritual tyrants who take unholy pleasure in requiring obedience and subordination of their followers. Deputy authority. It is important to recognize that leadership depends on followership, and from a truly Christian perspective, that means cooperation with the leader rather than domination and control by the leader. The source of legitimate Christian leadership, therefore, lies in entrusted authority. The spiritual autocrat, the religious dictator, attempts to compel subordination. The true Christian leader can legitimately only elicit followership. Okay, so then when your brain gets under the influence of power, they've done studies, and this talks about those studies. Subjects under the influence of power acted as if they suffered traumatic brain injury, becoming more impulsive, less risk aware, and crucially less adept at seeing things from other people's point of view. So a neuroscientist at McMaster University in Ontario described, when he looked at a transcranial magnetic stimulation machine's images, he found that power impairs a specific neural process called mirroring that may be the cornerstone of empathy. Once we have power, we lose some of the capacities we needed to gain it in the first place. We lose our capacity to empathize with others, and this can become hubris syndrome. Hubris syndrome is a disorder of the possession of power, particularly power which has been associated with overwhelming success, held for a period of years with minimal constraint on the leader. Symptoms include disproportionate concern with image and presentation, contempt for the advice or criticism of others, exaggerated self-belief in what they personally can achieve, loss of contact with reality, restlessness, recklessness, and impulsiveness. When leaders acquire power, power itself becomes an agent that may reduce the leader's capacity for empathy and compassion, especially towards those who are powerless or at least less powerful, like women, and they lose the very essence of Christianity, or you could say of the gospel. Okay, so there are 8 phases of power through fear culture. 1, it begins when power and authority are vested in one individual, and it can spread to other leaders and influencers in the congregation. Other leaders, some of whom are sycophants, riding the coattails of the narcissist's insatiable desire for glory, affirm that power and thus enhance it. So number 2, in a power through fear culture, the pastor or the leader's approval becomes the gold standard. So if you are not approved by the leader, then you can be seen as not approved by God. This is a sickness, a contagious disease, and can be deadly to the spiritual health of a congregation. Powerful pastors become associated too easily with God in the minds of the congregation. If the pastor approves me, one may feel, then God approves of me. Some pastors may want them thinking that way. Number 3, those approved by the power pastor gain status enhancement. So they're seen as an insider, as significant, as powerful. Their self-esteem goes up. They feel cool and in, and they become somewhat intoxicated with their newfound status. Ooh, I'm a blended brother now. Intoxicated with newfound status. And in the same way, power can also have the result of status degradation if the power is used to disapprove. So those in power, if they disapprove of you, your status can be degraded. Power-shaping culture transitions into a fear-shaped culture. Power-shaped culture becomes a fear-shaped culture. People who derive their status from pastors' approval live in constant fear of being disapproved at any time. So, unlike God's unconditional love, there is a culture of conditional approval. And Laura, one of the authors, says that she experienced this disapproval phase. She lost friendships, including one that was decades long. Oh, I've lost so many that are decades long. Over what she said on social media and for refusing to apologize for criticism of the church's handling of events. Her words did not match the conditions required for approval. Almost every victim, outspoken advocate, and resistor with whom she has connected has spoken of lost relationships. And this is important. Those who first bring forth allegations, she says women who brought forth the first allegations, and those who supported them endured the worst. So the first get the worst as far as the lost relationships. And I think of Jo Castile, who was somewhat a first among her generation to really speak out publicly and openly about her concerns. She suffered a great loss. 6, judgments and decisions are rendered behind a wall of secrecy. In a power through fear culture, the powerful pastor or powerful leader, because Lord's Recovery doesn't use the word pastor, powerful leader and close associates decide what information will be disseminated and what will be held back. The privilege of knowing what's really going on, one quickly learns, is for insiders' eyes and ears only. People resign and leave with no explanation, and only the insiders know why. This form of secrecy induces fear in other staff members to stay in line. When someone leaves, he or she is encouraged to end well. Don't talk. So secrecy remains. People have just disappeared, but the problems remain for us to all still deal with. Number 7, behind the wall of secrecy lurks a perpetual fear of status degradation. So along with fear of being demoted, there's a fear of being shamed by having one's status publicly revoked. Shame is the experience of being humiliated. So status degradation, demotion, shame, humiliation are all inevitable in a fear culture. Their presence is a warning that a fear culture exists. So if you have any fears of status degradation, demotion, shame, humiliation, losing of friends, losing of acceptance, of approval, if you speak out, you're in a fear culture. There also are these things called moles in fear culture. A communication conduit. And Witness Lee would say, I know everything that goes on in the recovery. Well, you can't unless you have moles. Communication conduits. So then people know that they're being watched and things could be reported to the narcissistic leader. They secretly report information. And number 8, This is extremely familiar to anyone who knows the Lord's recovery. The last phase of a power-based and fear-inducing culture is, no surprise, removal from the circle entirely. Banishment is the ultimate form of the power leader's disapproval. It is experienced as total rejection. It can feel to some like disapproval by God himself. Some lose their faith. More often, they need some form of mental health therapy. It takes years for some to trust leaders again. Many develop a keen eye for the signs of a fear culture. Detoxing from fear is hard, says Jill Monaco. I had a crippling fear of making mistakes or wrong decisions. Fear ran the show and controlled so many of my decisions. I would sacrifice what was good for me to keep the peace. There should be no fear of failure, fear of man, fear of authority, fear of independence, fear of consequences for speaking truth, fear of gossip, etc. in healthy organizations. So then let's go to the very last. Actually, there are 2 more sections here, and they are how toxic cultures respond to criticism and false narratives. So, forming and deforming a church's culture, part 1 of a church called Tov, a church called good. Good is almost a bad word, ironically, in the Lord's recovery. Okay, chapter 3 of this first section, forming and deforming a church's culture, is how toxic cultures respond to criticism. And I just want to read just what I've highlighted or underlined and not expound too much just because I'm getting tired. But anyway, I hope this is helpful. When an allegation arises against a pastor, a leader, or a volunteer within a church, what the pastor or leadership does first will reveal the culture of the church, whether it is toxic or tov. When an allegation arises against a leader, notice a leader, what the leadership does first will reveal the culture of the church. If the response is confession and repentance or a commitment to finding the truth, if all the facts are not yet known, that church probably has a healthy Tov culture. On the other hand, if the leader's first instinct is denial, some form of story or narrative about what really happened, or a defensive posture against those who would attack our church or those who would attack the ministry, there are toxic elements at work within that church's culture. So when there have been concerns expressed about leadership or about publications or about anything, practices, history of the Lord's recovery, what has been the first reaction of leaders? Is it confession, repentance, or a commitment to find the truth? Or is it denial, an alternate narrative about what really happened, a defensive posture, and accusation of those who would attack? I keep seeing the word attack about my videos. This isn't an attack. Okay, so a church should speak God's word, firstly. That is, use words God would use to describe sin. 2, be specific and succinct, honest and direct. 3, take unconditional and comprehensive responsibility. 4, express genuine remorse. Humbly ask forgiveness. 5, submit to change. 6, make appropriate restitution. 7, seek full reconciliation. And this has an important caveat. The goal of reconciliation is to restore a sinner to fellowship, not a leader to power. Okay, I love what a brother shared. This brother, his name is Robert Cunningham, and he was a leader at a Presbyterian church in Lexington, Kentucky, a senior minister. He tweeted, "Neither truth nor love are ever convenient. Choose them anyway." And when the #MeToo movement started rising and it was affecting even some of the church congregations, he wrote, I say, let the stories come. Let them all come out. Let every attempt to deflect or defend come to an end. Let us listen and learn from the courage of the abused. They are our prophets now, with voices that will no longer allow us to hide or ignore the epidemic. Indeed, the overdue purge has begun, and may it not relent until every hidden darkness faces the light of justice. Cunningham learned of abuse in his own congregation and responded by notifying pastors, elders, the congregation. He called a congregational meeting to share information and field questions, reported the abuse to police, who declined to investigate further, and hired an outside party to complete a thorough investigation. He was determined to try to make things right, to be as transparent as possible, to seek healing for all the victims. He felt an obligation to the church and to the victims to do the right thing. That is a healthy church culture. Okay, then there's a section on spinning, Matthew 18. Excellent. I'm not going to read that. And requiring 2 or 3 witnesses, when in the case of like sexual abuse, there often are not 2 or 3 witnesses. Keeping it in-house. Eventually, however, though it may take a very long time, the truth will come out when a congregation learns that all the denials, all the spin and alternative narratives were a lie. The church's culture is unmasked as toxic, and the leaders are shown to be complicit, even intentionally deceptive at times. The word most often on the lips of Jesus for this was hypocrisy. Pastors, leaders, and congregants in a church with a tov, with a good culture, are free to tell stories that are true. In toxic church cultures, leaders tell stories that are false, while the congregation either goes along with the deception or lives in blissful ignorance. But in a healthy church culture, people are all free to tell the truth. So chapter 4 of Forming and Deforming a Church's Culture is called False Narratives. I just want to read what I've underlined. Okay. God wired us as humans to make sense of our lives through storytelling. Lying is a form of storytelling when something goes wrong, a way of spinning a story in our own direction, either out of deceit, self-preservation, or self-interest. That is lying. Corrupt leaders try to control the narrative to protect the reputation of the leaders, the church, or the ministry. Okay, so firstly, in false narratives, there's discrediting the critics. They attack their character. They call them liars. They do character assassination. They question the motives of those who come forward. And I think of like the accusation and fermentation of the present rebellion, unfulfilled ambition, unforgiven offenses, or even rebellion. Those are all stated, not actually dealing with the problems that brothers brought forth. Demonizing the critics as evildoers trying to harm the church. If the critics are evil, then they're not to be trusted, so one can just dismiss what they say. They use phrases like, what these men are saying is satanic. We warn you to separate yourself from these false messengers. Avoid these people at all costs, lest you incur great detriment to your own soul. You know who the accuser of the brothers is. It's Satan. So this is just satanic. They spin the story. And that's just classic with fermentation of the present rebellion. Spinning a story is a deceitful strategy designed to hijack the accuser's narrative and create an alternative version, an intentionally false narrative that supports whatever the leader wants the church to believe. So look at fermentation of the present rebellion and a response to recent accusations as classic examples of spinning the story. Then gaslighting the critics. This is a vicious psychological element to false narrative where they cover up criminal activity or other unrighteous activity by sowing seeds of doubt in a targeted individual, making them question their own memory, perception, or judgment, using denial, misdirection, contradiction, misinformation to destabilize the victim and delegitimize the victim's belief. And I have been gaslit in the Lord's Recovery by the prominent leaders, and I have examples, but won't go into them. Okay. making the perpetrator the victim. So I gave an example recently when Ron Kingas talked about being reviled by Steve Isett, or he didn't mention Steve's name at the time, but Steve's the one being reviled. He just asked for time to fellowship. He wasn't reviling leaders, but the whole narrative was that Ron was experiencing being reviled. He did not revile in return. So making the perpetrator the victim, false victimization narratives can reverse everything, and the perpetrators become the victims. Anger is misdirected. Listeners are angry with accusers, those who came forward with reports of abuse, but they become the object of the anger for their mistreatment of the church or of the leadership. Victims can be called accusers, revilers, that they are attacking the Lord's church or the Lord's interests, that they just can't seem to let it go. So they're implied of being people that just hold on to offenses. Leaders can bring attention to their pain and how sad it is that they're being exposed, so others grant them compassion and support that should normally be given to the wronged. They tarnish the reputation of the accusers at the same time. I love this quote by Mary DeMuth. It's a tweet about a false victimization narrative. She said, "Let me be clear." And I have one of her books, We Too. I would like to read from that too sometime to you all. "Let me be clear. To out a predator publicly is not gossip. It is justice. It is protecting more people from being harmed. Brave disclosure is the very essence of God, whose heart always bends to the vulnerable. To not speak up is sin." Let's flip the narrative, folks. And then silencing the truth is attempted. Silenced truth is an unspoken lie. And one of the main narratives that the Lord's Recovery uses is cover Noah in his tent. That's basically to silence people. Don't be like Ham that exposes your father's nakedness. Just go in backwards and cover him. But that's not in a case of abuse. It's not in a case of sinning. It's in a case of your father being naked in his own tent. The church makes a conscious choice to protect itself rather than reflecting the Jesus it claims to follow when it silences the truth. Suppressing the truth by using shaming, intimidation, threatening, destruction of evidence. Accusing the accuser of sowing discord, division, or bearing false witness. They do that in Shepherding Words. Saying, "Oh, be careful, they're bearing false witness." Christians' virtue of silence. The Catholics talk about a Christian's virtue of silence. This is just another false, truth-suppressing narrative that's been used by believers. When the truth is suppressed and silence is maintained, abusers are able to move on and abuse and wound others. When silence and suppression become false narratives, the story they tell is that victims don't matter and abusers' acts are not worthy of discovery. And then issuing a fake apology, often that condemns the victim as well. So that is the end of the first part of forming and deforming a church's culture. And I hope that was helpful, and I hope you would prayerfully consider anything in this that you can relate to, and that when I read about a church called Tov, part 2, the circle of Tov, the circle of goodness, I hope that we would have more of that in whatever church community you are. Thank you.